Picture this. A barefoot child from one of Mexico's most forgotten villages picking avocados in the scorching Michoacan heat, while other kids his age sat in classrooms learning to read. No shoes, no future, no name that anyone outside his village would ever know. Fast forward 6 decades, and that same man had built the most powerful drug cartel on the planet, commanded an army of over 100,000 foot soldiers, flooded American streets with enough fentanyl to kill millions, and carried a $15 million bounty on his head, the largest reward the United States government had ever offered for a living drug lord. His name was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The world knew him as El Mencho. And on February 22, 2026, Mexican Special Forces finally cornered him in the hills of Tapalpa, Jalisco, and ended the reign of the most dangerous man the Western Hemisphere had ever produced. But here is the thing that will completely rewire the way you think about this story. El Mencho was not a street kid who fell into crime because he had no choice. He was not a cartel soldier who clawed his way to the top through brute force alone. No. Before he became the most feared narco in Mexican history, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes wore a badge. He was a cop, a sworn law enforcement officer who used his position inside the system to learn exactly how to destroy it from the outside. And that is what makes this story unlike anything you have ever heard before. Stay until the end because I'm going to break down exactly how a poverty-stricken avocado farmer's son became the architect of a trillion-dollar criminal empire, how he outmaneuvered the DEA, the FBI, and the entire Mexican military for over 2 decades, and how his own fortress of secrecy ultimately became the trap that killed him. To understand El Mencho, you have to understand where he came from, because the distance between where he started and where he ended is almost impossible to comprehend. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes was born on July 17, 1966, in Aguililla, a tiny dust-choked municipality deep in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Michoacan. Aguililla is the kind of place that does not appear on most maps, a village so isolated that for decades its only connection to the outside world was a single road carved into the mountainside. There was no electricity grid, no running water, no hospital. His family survived the way almost everyone in Aguililla survived, by farming avocados on the steep terraced hillsides that surrounded the village. The work was relentless and the pay was almost nothing. Nemesio dropped out of school before he completed primary education, not because he was unintelligent, as you will discover he was anything but because there was no economic logic in going to school when your family needed your hands in the fields. He was the product of a system that had already decided his worth before he had a chance to prove otherwise. But Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was not built to accept the life that had been handed to him, and that refusal, that burning, absolute refusal to die poor and nameless in those avocado fields is what set everything else in motion. In the early 1980s, he did what hundreds of thousands of young men from rural Michoacan had done before him. He crossed the border, illegally, into the United States. He settled in California, where the Mexican immigrant community was vast and the underground economy was thriving. He was young, he was ambitious, and he was willing to do whatever it took. And in California's drug corridors, doing whatever it took meant one thing. The first time American authorities caught Nemesio Oseguera was small, just another low-level mule in the enormous machinery of cross-border narcotics trafficking. But law enforcement noted something about him that set him apart from the usual street-level operatives they processed. He was disciplined, he was quiet, he never gave anything up. He was arrested multiple times in the late 1980s and early 1990s for drug-related offenses. And then, in 1994, the U.S. justice system finally caught up to him in a serious way. He was convicted in a federal court in California of conspiracy to distribute heroin. The sentence, 3 years in a U.S. federal prison. Now, you might expect a first serious prison sentence to be a wake-up call, a moment of reflection, a reason to walk away. But here's where it gets interesting, because for Nemesio Oseguera, federal prison was not a punishment, it was a curriculum. Just like Ryan Wedding in a San Diego detention center surrounded by cartel mules, Nemesio spent 3 years inside the American system, watching, listening, and cataloging every piece of intelligence he could extract from the men around him. When he was released and deported back to Mexico in 1997, he crossed the border carrying something far more dangerous than drugs. He carried knowledge. But here is where this story takes the turn that nobody sees coming. Most men deported back to Mexico after a U.S. drug conviction go straight back to the trade. Nemesio Oseguera did something that no historian of the drug war fully anticipated. He applied to become a police officer, and he was accepted. In the state of Jalisco, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, a man with a U.S. federal drug conviction, pinned on a badge and became a sworn member of law enforcement. Think about what that means for a moment. He was now inside the very system designed to stop men like him. He had access to informant networks. He could see how investigations were built. He understood which officers were corruptible, which weren't, and most importantly, how the police actually found people like him. This was not a desperate man taking the only job available to him. This was a calculated move. Nemesio used his time in uniform the way a chess grandmaster uses a sacrifice piece to gain position. He memorized tactical procedures. He built relationships inside law enforcement that would later become his most valuable assets, not as allies, but as people he could compromise. He learned the exact communication frequencies, surveillance methods, and raid protocols that Mexican federal police used against cartels. He was building a blueprint for invisibility. And when he had extracted everything he needed from that badge, he took it off and went to work for the other side. Keep watching, because what he did next is where this story shifts from extraordinary to genuinely unprecedented. He did not start his own operation, not yet. That was not how the smartest players entered the narco world. Instead, Nemesio went to work for one of the most powerful cartel bosses in western Mexico, Armando Valencia Cornelio, nicknamed El Maradona, who ran the Milenio cartel out of Jalisco and Michoacan. El Maradona was a serious player. His organization controlled methamphetamine and cocaine supply lines across multiple Mexican states and had direct connections to Colombian suppliers. For a man with Nemesio's ambitions, it was the perfect school. He rose quickly. Within the Milenio cartel's structure, Nemesio demonstrated exactly the qualities that made him dangerous: discipline, strategic intelligence, and an absolute willingness to use extreme violence without hesitation or remorse. He was not the loudest man in the room, he never was, but he was always the most prepared. He planned operations with a precision that felt almost military. He studied his enemies the way he had once studied law enforcement, and he built loyalty through a combination of generous payment and the very credible threat of what happened to those who crossed him. But Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes had not survived poverty, illegal immigration, a U.S. federal prison, and a career as a corrupt cop to spend his life as someone else's lieutenant. And here is the move that revealed exactly who he really was. When the Milenio cartel came under pressure and its power began to fragment, Nemesio did not go down with the ship. He did something cold. He made contact with the Sinaloa cartel, then the dominant force in Mexican narcotics under El Chapo Guzman, and he offered them something invaluable: information about his own boss. He helped engineer the circumstances that led to El Maradona's downfall, and in doing so, he positioned himself for the ultimate power play. Let that sink in for a second. This man had already betrayed the United States justice system by returning to crime after deportation. He had betrayed the Mexican state by using a badge as a criminal intelligence gathering tool. And now he had betrayed his own cartel boss to climb one more rung on the ladder. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was not driven by loyalty to anyone or anything except his own ascent. And that clarity of purpose, that cold, unsentimentally ruthless vision, is what separated him from every other criminal who came before him. By the mid-2000s, the Mexican cartel landscape was fracturing. The Milenio cartel was disintegrating, the Sinaloa cartel was overextended, and in the vacuum that these collapsing power structures left behind, Nemesio saw not a crisis but an opportunity. He began consolidating, quietly at first, drawing together the most capable operators from the wreckage of the Milenio organization, building a core of trusted lieutenants, establishing supply lines, mapping territory, and sometime around 2007, alongside his associate, Eric Valencia, known as the L-85, the foundation was laid for what would become the most feared criminal organization in the Western Hemisphere, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG. Now, in the early years, nobody outside of Jalisco was paying serious attention to the CJNG. That was exactly how Nemesio wanted it. While other cartels made headlines with public executions, cartel bosses filmed music videos, and narco ballads celebrated their leaders by name, El Mencho built his organization in near total silence. No interviews, no narco corridors about himself, almost no photographs. To this day, the DEA has confirmed only a handful of verified images of Nemesio Risiguera Cervantes exist in existence. Think about how remarkable that is for a man who would eventually command over 100,000 people. And here is what made the CJNG fundamentally different from every cartel that came before it. El Mencho did not just build a drug trafficking organization, he built a corporation. He recruited university graduates, not street soldiers, for his financial and legal departments. Young men and women with degrees in accounting, law, and logistics who could construct the kind of financial architecture that would make the CJNG's money flows nearly impossible to trace. He structured the cartel like a franchise model, with regional commanders operating semi-independently under a unified brand and supply chain. This is the detail that made DEA analysts stop and stare. This was not a gang. This was a multinational business. The CJNG's product portfolio was deliberately diversified. Yes, cocaine and heroin were the foundation, but El Mencho understood before almost anyone else in the cartel world that fentanyl was the future. He established clandestine laboratories across Jalisco and Zacatecas manufacturing synthetic opioids with a profit margin that made cocaine look inefficient. A kilogram of fentanyl manufactured for approximately $3,000 in a CJNG lab could be cut and distributed on American streets for over $1.5 million in retail value. The math was obscene, and El Mencho scaled it ruthlessly. The CJNG took control of the deep water port at Manzanillo in Colima, one of Mexico's busiest, which allowed them to receive fentanyl precursor chemicals directly from Chinese suppliers without the friction of land border interdiction. But here is where the CJNG's rise becomes genuinely terrifying in its scale and audacity. By 2012, the organization had expanded from its Jalisco base into Colima, Michoacán, Veracruz, Guanajuato, and Chiapas. By 2015, they were operating in over 28 of Mexico's 32 states. They had not just grown, they had colonized. Everywhere they went, the CJNG brought the same message: submit or be destroyed. Local governments received two options: accept cartel money and protection, or face consequences that had already been demonstrated in graphic video messages circulated online. The terror was systemic. The expansion was military in its precision. The DEA was watching all of this with growing alarm. By 2015, internal assessments ranked the CJNG as one of the world's most powerful and dangerous drug trafficking organizations, alongside and in some metrics surpassing the Sinaloa cartel. What made El Mencho so difficult to target was precisely the corporate architecture he had built. Law enforcement could arrest regional commanders, seize shipments, even take down entire distribution networks, and the CJNG would simply route around the damage like the internet routes around a broken node. There was no single point of failure, and the man at the top remained a ghost. The DEA's narcotics rewards program placed Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes at the top of their most wanted list with a $15 million reward, the maximum they had ever offered for any individual in history. The U.S. State Department added its own layer of pressure, and yet, for years, El Mencho remained untouchable. Not because he was lucky, but because he had engineered his untouchability from the very beginning, using everything he had learned in that California prison, inside that Jalisco police station, and from a decade of watching other cartel leaders make the mistakes he refused to repeat. Stay with me, because what happens next in May 2015 is the moment that told the entire world exactly who El Mencho was, and it is unlike anything in the history of the drug war. Mexican federal authorities had been building a case against CJNG leadership and moved to execute a major interdiction operation in Villa Purificación, Jalisco. El Mencho's men did not run, they did not surrender, they launched a military-grade counterattack. CJNG fighters armed with rocket-propelled grenade launchers shot a Mexican army helicopter out of the sky, killing 9 soldiers. 9, not cartel rivals, uniformed soldiers of the Mexican military. The battle that followed spread across 20 different towns and 3 neighboring states. CJNG operatives set 39 buses on fire, they burned 11 banks, they destroyed 16 gas stations. They erected roadblocks across the entire Guadalajara metropolitan area to slow military mobilization and allow their leader to escape into the mountains. In a single afternoon, El Mencho had sent a message to the Mexican government, to the DEA, and to every remaining independent operator in the country simultaneously. I am not afraid of your army. I am the army. The helicopter attack was not recklessness, it was a calculated declaration. El Mencho understood something that previous cartel leaders had not. In the narco world, perception is power. The moment that news of a cartel shooting down a military helicopter spread through Mexico's underworld, every remaining independent operator in the country began reassessing their options. Surrender their territory to the CJNG, or wait to see what happened to those who didn't? The answer to that question was never pleasant. Now the DEA's focus on El Mencho shifted from a priority to an obsession. But here is the fundamental problem they faced, and it is a problem that would haunt law enforcement for another decade. They had almost nothing to work with. No confirmed address, no known vehicle, no communication intercepts. El Mencho operated on a communications protocol so disciplined that senior DEA analysts described it as unlike anything they had encountered before. He used intermediaries for every instruction. He never spoke on a phone himself. He moved constantly between secure locations in the Jalisco highlands, terrain so rugged and so loyal to him that any ground approach risked triggering exactly the kind of armed ambush that had already killed 9 soldiers. And while the DEA hunted a ghost, the CJNG's empire continued to expand at a pace that defied comprehension. By 2017, the organization was generating an estimated $3 billion to $4 billion annually from drug trafficking alone, not counting the billions more from fuel theft, extortion, human trafficking, and illegal mining. El Mencho had effectively privatized entire sectors of Mexico's underground economy. His net worth, according to DEA estimates, sat somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion. For a man who had once picked avocados barefoot in Michoacan, the numbers were almost cosmically absurd. The CJNG's violence during this period was not random, it was curated. Every execution, every mass killing, every video message, all of it served a strategic communications function. When rival cartel members were captured, they were not simply eliminated, they were made into messages. The CJNG became expert at using social media and messaging platforms to distribute footage of these executions at scale, creating a climate of terror that made recruitment into the cartel feel less like a choice and more like the only rational survival option. El Mencho understood information warfare before most governments did. Keep watching, because we are about to get into the part of this story that the DEA files almost never talk about, the human beings who got ground up in El Mencho's machinery. And this is where the true cost of his empire becomes impossible to look away from. But first, the family. Because El Mencho's operation was, at its core, a family business. His wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, known by authorities as a key financial architect of the CJNG's money laundering operations through a network called Los Queenies, was eventually arrested. His daughter, Laisha Oseguera, nicknamed the La Negra, was arrested in 2019. His brother was arrested. His son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, El Menchito, was extradited to the United States and convicted in a federal court. One by one, the people closest to El Mencho were stripped away, and yet he remained free. The CJNG's war against the Mexican state during this period produced atrocities that never made international headlines because they were so frequent that they had become background noise. In 2013, the organization assassinated Jesus Gallegos Alvarez, the tourism secretary of Jalisco, a cabinet-level government official, in broad daylight. In 2014, they murdered Congressman Gabriel Gomez Michel, a sitting member of the federal legislature. These were not random targets, they were demonstrations of impunity. El Mencho was telling the Mexican state, I can reach anyone, anywhere, and there is nothing you can do about it. Now, imagine you are a DEA analyst in 2018. You have been chasing this man for 5 years. You have watched him shoot down a military helicopter. You have watched him kill politicians. You have watched his organization metastasize across 28 states. And you have almost nothing that puts you closer to finding him than you were the day you started. This is not a failure of effort. Every law enforcement resource available had been thrown at the CJNG. This was a failure against a system of concealment so sophisticated that some senior investigators began to wonder privately whether El Mencho was receiving intelligence tips from inside their own agencies. And those suspicions were not paranoid. The CJNG's penetration of Mexican law enforcement institutions was, by the organization's own later admissions, extensive. El Mencho had not forgotten what he learned as a police officer in Jalisco. He knew that the most reliable way to stay ahead of law enforcement was to be inside law enforcement. The cartel paid monthly retainers to officers across multiple states, not for specific services, but simply for access to information, early warning systems. The moment a major operation against the CJNG was being planned in any federal agency, El Mencho wanted to know about it before the first car left the parking lot. Stay with me, because this is where we need to talk about the human beings whose names you will never see in a DEA press release. The ordinary people whose lives were destroyed, not because of any involvement with narcotics, not because of any choices they made, but simply because they happened to exist in territory that El Mencho had decided belonged to him. In the state of Guanajuato, the CJNG's war against the rival Santa Rosa de la Lima cartel produced a civilian death toll that international human rights organizations described as comparable to an active armed conflict. Entire villages emptied as families fled the fighting. In 2019 alone, Guanajuato recorded over 3,000 homicides, making it the most violent state in Mexico and one of the most violent places on Earth by per capita murder rate. Behind every statistic was a name. There was the case of the 24 farm workers in Irapuato, Guanajuato, shot dead in a drug rehabilitation center in June 2020. 24 men who had gone somewhere to try to recover from addiction. Gunmen walked in during a session and executed them. The CJNG was identified by Mexican authorities as responsible. The youngest victim was 15 years old. He had gone to the center with his father. They were killed together. There was the Valeria Marquez case that shocked all of Mexico in 2025, a social media influencer with hundreds of thousands of followers broadcasting live on her social media channel when a gunman walked into her business in Zapopan, Jalisco, and shot her dead on camera while her audience watched. A senior CJNG lieutenant close to El Mencho, Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, was identified by U.S. Treasury as a prime suspect. It was not a robbery. It was not random. It was the CJNG sending a message about what happened to people who existed in their sphere of influence without paying proper tribute. The videos circulated for days before platforms could remove it. The reach of the CJNG's violence was not limited to Mexico. By the early 2020s, the organization had established operational cells in over 25 countries using the same franchise model that had conquered Mexico to build a truly global distribution network. The fentanyl flooding American communities, the drug responsible for over 70,000 American deaths in 2023 alone, flowed through pipelines that ultimately led back to CJNG labs in Jalisco and Zacatecas. El Mencho was not just Mexico's problem. He was a weapon of mass destruction operating in slow motion across the entire Western world. And throughout all of it, the helicopter attack, the assassinations of politicians, the mass executions, the fentanyl epidemic, the global expansion, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes remained invisible. a handful of blurry photographs, a voice on intercepted radio transmissions that analysts could never fully confirm was him, a physical description that placed him somewhere between 5'8" and 5'10", with a stocky build and a mustache. That was all law enforcement had to work with for the better part of 2 decades. The most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere, and he had successfully made himself almost entirely not real to the people hunting him. But here's the thing about invisibility. Maintaining it requires absolute discipline from everyone around you, not just yourself. And as the CJNG empire grew to employ tens of thousands of people, the probability that one of them would eventually crack or be turned or make a mistake that pulled back the curtain, that probability approached certainty. It was not a question of if, it was a question of when. By 2024, Mexican and American intelligence services had been quietly building a composite picture of El Mencho's actual location and movement patterns for months, not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through the slow accumulation of tiny signals. A delivery truck that made the same route twice a week into the Jalisco highlands, an unusual concentration of encrypted radio traffic in the region around Tapalpa, the disappearance of known CJNG logistics coordinators from their usual haunts, suggesting they had been pulled to support a secure location. And then, in a move that demonstrated exactly how much the calculus had changed under the Trump administration's intensified pressure on Mexico, a newly established U.S. military intelligence task force became directly involved in the operation. The U.S. provided signals intelligence, satellite surveillance, and technical support that the Mexican military used to triangulate El Mencho's location with a precision that previous operations had never achieved. This was not Mexico acting alone. This was the full weight of American intelligence infrastructure being brought to bear on a single target. On the night of February 21, 2026, Mexican special forces began staging in the mountains south of Guadalajara. The operation was planned in total secrecy, no communications over any channel that could have been intercepted by CJNG informants inside law enforcement. The operational command was restricted to a small team whose identities were not disclosed. At dawn on February 22nd, the assault force moved on a compound in Tapalpa, a small town in the southern highlands of Jalisco, less than 100 kilometers from Guadalajara. The CJNG fighters guarding the compound did not surrender. They never do. A firefight erupted that the Mexican Defense Ministry later described as intense and sustained. 4 CJNG associates were killed at the scene. 3 Mexican soldiers were wounded. Rockets and heavy weapons were recovered from the compound, including the same type of armored vehicles and rocket launchers that the CJNG had used to shoot down that military helicopter over a decade ago. And during the fighting, Nemesio Oseguera Cesantes was hit, seriously wounded. He did not die in the compound. This detail matters. He was taken alive initially and was being transported by aircraft to Mexico City, the same city where, for decades, federal prosecutors had dreamed of one day holding him accountable. But his wounds were too severe. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, the barefoot child from Aguililla, who had built the most powerful cartel in the history of the Western Hemisphere, died on February 22, 2026. The reaction was immediate and violent. Within hours of the news breaking, CJNG loyalists launched coordinated attacks across Mexico in a demonstration of what happens when you kill the king. Vehicles were set on fire in Guadalajara, one of the host cities for the 2026 FIFA World Cup scheduled for June. Roadblocks went up across Jalisco. Armed clashes with the National Guard erupted in 8 different states simultaneously. The U.S. State Department issued emergency shelter-in-place warnings for American citizens in Jalisco, Tamaulipas, Michoacán, Guerrero, and Nuevo León. Major airlines, including United, American, Aeromexico, and Air Canada, canceled flights to Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta, a tourist destination paralyzed by the death of a drug lord. El Mencho's remains were transported to Mexico City under heavy National Guard escort. The Mexican Defense Ministry confirmed the operation had been, in their words, strategically organized and executed by specialized forces. The White House press secretary confirmed that the United States had provided intelligence assistance and that the Trump administration applauds and expresses gratitude to the Mexican military. The $15 million bounty would never be paid in the conventional sense, but for the law enforcement officers who had spent decades hunting this man, the accounting was finally settled. And now that the noise has died down and the fires have been extinguished and the flights have resumed, it is worth sitting with what this man actually cost the world. Not the DEA statistics, not the Treasury figures, the actual human cost. The fentanyl that CJNG Laboratories manufactured under Mencho's direction has been linked by public health researchers to tens of thousands of American deaths every single year for the better part of a decade. In 2023 alone, fentanyl overdose deaths in the United States exceeded 73,000 people. 73,000. That is more Americans than died in the entire Vietnam War. Not all of that fentanyl came from CJNG, but a significant, documented, prosecuted portion of it did. In Mexico, the human cost is harder to tabulate because it has been so relentlessly continuous. The CJNG's wars for territory have directly contributed to making Mexico one of the most violent countries on Earth, despite not being in a declared state of war. Entire communities in Michoacan, Guanajuato, and Jalisco have been depopulated. Hundreds of thousands of Mexicans have been internally displaced, forced from their homes and farms not by a natural disaster, but by a criminal army that Mencho built and directed. There are the families of the 9 soldiers killed when the CJNG shot down that helicopter in 2015. There are the families of the 24 men executed in the Irapuato Rehabilitation Center. There is Valeria Marquez's family watching their daughter die on a live stream. There is the family of every politician who received a death threat because they were in the way of CJNG's expansion. And behind it all, pulling every string, moving every piece, a man who was born with nothing and who decided that the only response to a world that had given him nothing was to take everything. So what killed Mencho in the end? It was not a single mistake. It was not arrogance in the way that destroyed Ryan Wedding, the flashy motorcycles, the digital footprint, the ego that needed to be seen. Mencho was too disciplined for that. What killed him was the mathematics of running an organization of this size for this long. You can build the most sophisticated concealment system in criminal history. You can go decades without a confirmed photograph. You can move constantly and communicate through layers of intermediaries. But when you are commanding over 100,000 people across 28 states and 25 countries, the statistical probability that someone will eventually give you up under torture, under financial pressure, or under the weight of a deal that keeps their children alive approaches absolute certainty. The compound in Tapalpa was discovered not through genius or luck. It was discovered through the relentless, grinding accumulation of intelligence from sources who had, for one reason or another, decided that the risk of talking was lower than the risk of staying silent. And in a country where the CJNG had demonstrated its ability to reach anyone, anywhere, the person who finally pointed the crosshairs at Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was either the bravest individual in Mexico or the most desperate. We may never know which. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was 59 years old when he died. He had spent over 30 years building, expanding, and defending an empire that began in the dirt floors of Aguililla and ended in the highlands of Jalisco, with soldiers closing in from every direction. He had survived the American prison system, a deportation, a career as a corrupt cop, multiple cartel wars, a helicopter attack that he ordered, the arrest of his wife, his daughter, his brother, and his son, and over 2 decades of being the most hunted man in the Western Hemisphere. In the end, he was found not in some distant jungle compound or fortified bunker, but relatively close to home, in the same state of Jalisco where he had built everything. The mountains had hidden him for years, but on February 22, 2026, they were not enough. The CJNG did not die with Mencho. That is the uncomfortable truth that Mexican and American authorities have been careful to acknowledge. The franchise model he built was specifically designed to survive the loss of its founder. Regional commanders across 28 states continue to operate. The fentanyl labs continue to produce. The port at Manzanillo continues to receive precursor chemicals. The corporation continues to function, now likely moving toward a succession battle that analysts predict will produce a new wave of cartel violence as El Mencho's lieutenants fight for control of his throne. But something has changed. El Mencho spent 20 years being mythologized in Mexico's narco culture as genuinely untouchable, a man who looked the Mexican army in the eye, shot down their helicopter, and walked away. That myth is now over. And in the narco world, where myth is currency, that matters more than any seizure or arrest. The most important thing that died on February 22, 2026, was not Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. It was the idea that he could not be reached. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes started with nothing. No education, no money, no connections, no future that anyone would have predicted for him in those avocado fields in Michoacan. And he turned that nothing into the most powerful criminal organization the Western Hemisphere has ever seen. Through intelligence, ruthlessness, discipline, and a willingness to betray anyone and destroy anything that stood between him and power. He was, in the clinical sense, a genius, a strategic mind that understood systems, police systems, cartel systems, financial systems, political systems, and knew precisely how to exploit each one. That genius produced billions of dollars, a global empire, and a body count that will take historians decades to fully calculate. But the child who picked avocados in Aguililla, the child who deserved, like every child, a chance at something real, never had to become this. That is the thing about El Mencho's story that history will struggle with long after the CJNG's next chapter is written. The system that produced him, the poverty, the exclusion, the lack of any visible path forward, that system is still producing more of him right now in villages exactly like Aguililla, all across Mexico and Central America. El Mencho is dead. The conditions that created him are not. From barefoot avocado farmer's son to the most wanted man on the planet. From a U.S. federal prison to commanding 100,000 soldiers. From a cop's badge to a helicopter-killing army. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes built everything from nothing and left nothing but destruction in his wake. If you want to see more stories about the men who built empires on the suffering of others and how those empires always, eventually fall, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until next time, stay safe out there.